Well, in fact, this view seems very metaphysical. It seems like a metaphysical question, what is now or what is it to be now? But in fact, the time being now seems to me in a way the most empirical of claims, or an extremely empirical claim. For example, nobody has experienced the past. Right, well, maybe there are time machines or something like that, but normally, in common sense, if you like, we do not experience the past and we do not experience the future. We experience now.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.
Hi guys, you're watching Common Sense Generation, and with me is Professor Stephen Priest from Oxford University. Professor, thank you very much for coming.
My pleasure.
Talking about philosophy and philosophical questions today.
Yeah.
Well, it's been more than 2,000 years of philosophizing, let's say, from the ancient Greek.
Yeah.
And so why is it still important?
Yeah, I mean, J.L. Austin, the Oxford 1950s linguistic philosopher, said that importance is not important, truth is, right? And I think sometimes philosophy is important and sometimes philosophy is not important. You have to remember that importance is a relationship. I mean, importance means important for this, you know, saving lives, building bridges, getting to the moon, and so on. And importance is importance to somebody, important to me to get to the moon, or important for me to save the life of this child, and so on.
Or to me to make money.
Now, if you look at philosophical questions, all they have in common is that we have no method for answering them. Some of them might turn out to be important for certain purposes to certain people, and some might not. I mean, I can think of two ways in which philosophy has been important over the last 100 years, say, in mathematical logic and in artificial intelligence. Alan Turing wrote his seminal papers in artificial intelligence in the philosophy journal Mind. And Turing is recognizably not just a mathematician, but also a philosopher. So you could say, really, that, and that includes the Turing test, of course. So you could say that artificial intelligence, as we know it today, is caused by philosophy, or it was because people were engaged in trying to solve philosophical problems that we have AI as we know it now, and as it will enormously inflate into the future. And the other example is mathematical logic, because without Frege and Russell and Whitehead and Gödel, we would not have mathematical logic as the branch of mathematics, or the interface between mathematics, one interface between philosophy and mathematics that we have it today. So these two developments are massively important, but I suspect it would have been very difficult to predict before the 20th century, or before the early years of the 20th century, that there would be this development in AI or in mathematical logic. And people could have thought, well, Frege, Russell, what are you doing with these symbols? You know, or you, Turing, what are you doing building this machine that you think can solve computational problems? So it's funny, I think, I mean, I often experience two reactions to philosophy. One is it's completely unimportant and self-indulgent, and there should be no such thing, and you're wasting your time. And the other reaction is I find it absolutely terrifying. It's about facing death. It's about knowing what your existence is, what your responsibility is, how you should exercise your freedom, how I deal with the death of my relations, and things like that. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes both views in the same individual, right?
I remember at the first years of my philosophy studying, I heard from some professor that don't be a believer of a first theory you ever be able to comprehend.
Yeah.
And funny thing is that To be honest, the first real philosopher you encounter is Plato. But in my experience, at least in philosophy, you never grow out of Plato. You come back to him all the time with finding new things in Plato.
That's very often the case, I think, but maybe not always. I mean, in these two examples, mathematical logic and AI, I think there's probably no mathematical logic and no AI in Plato. But very often, the problem is addressed by Plato. Some problem in metaphysics or in epistemology or in political philosophy. I mean, I think when you say it's said that you should not believe the first theory that you encounter, I think there are different ways of viewing that. One way of viewing it is that, well, it might be a mistake because maybe the first theory is the correct one, right? That's always possible. But to be more sympathetic to the view, I think possibly the hardest part of doing philosophy is understanding the questions, and possibly the biggest obstacle to understanding the questions is assuming or thinking that we already understand the questions, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. I'll give you 3 examples. One about your own existence, one about now, and one about being. I mean, these are metaphysical questions, really. I mean, I think there's a profound philosophical question about why something is you, If we ask, why is this person you, that's very hard to understand. Now, it seems not difficult to understand. It might be very complicated. You think, well, this woman was born in such and such a town in this country, and she had these parents, she's got this genetic makeup, she had this education, and now she's interested in political philosophy and doing podcasts. You can imagine an enormous amount of information, and you say, look, as a result of this, look, it's her. But now all that information could be correct. It would be an enormous amount of information, but it doesn't begin to answer the question why you are this human being. It explains a lot about why this human being is the way she is. But what I mean is you view the world from this human being, but all the other human beings are over here, right? All the human beings in China, in England, in Croatia, in France, in the past, in the future, and now all those human beings are not you. But just one of the human beings is very strange. This human being is inside out or outside in. You don't view just one human being. You don't see it from the standpoint of exteriority, as we might say. You are it, or you're inside it, or you're centered on it, or you view the world from it, or you feel yourself to be coextensive with it. Now, really, we've got no idea. We have no idea why a human being is you. We haven't got any idea. And you can do neuroscience, sociology, Freudian psychoanalysis, genetics, it doesn't matter. It's not going to begin to answer this question. Now, this is what I mean by we've got no method for answering philosophical questions, and it's what I mean when I say that the hardest part is understanding the philosophical questions, because to understand the philosophical questions, you have to see something that you've never seen before. You have to see something you've never seen before, right? And in this sense, it's not really true that philosophy is part of common sense. Philosophy can break up common sense or be a bit subversive of common sense at this metaphysical level. Now, there are lots of philosophical questions which are in a way unusual, or unless you start to think in these ways, you don't grasp them. And they're profound questions. I mean, I think there's a profound question about why the time is now. Why the time is now.
Or what is now.
Yeah,
right?
what is, exactly. That's a better way of putting it, perhaps. What is now? Or what is it for the time to be now? And of course, in philosophy, you've got there is no now, it's only now. The now is always changing. There's only the future and the past. You've got all these permutations. But I'm inclined to say that there is something in all these theories, if you draw careful enough distinctions, you can say that it's true in a way that the now is always changing, because, you know, from one moment to the next, something is coming and going, beginning to be and ceasing to be.
What I say right now becomes already to the past.
Yeah, as you're speaking. Yeah.
As I'm speaking.
Yeah.
But on
Yeah.
the other hand,
yeah.
it is only now because
Yeah.
we live in this moment.
Yeah.
And we cannot go back to the past, so we cannot go go to the future.
Yeah.
Extremely interesting, I agree.
It is.
And deeply troubling when we want to be so practical.
Yeah, I know.
When we want to be efficient, and we don't want to ask all of those questions.
I think maybe in human society, there have been thousands of human societies, but maybe especially in modern post-industrial capitalism, we're always on the way to something. We always want more money, more status, more food, a bigger house, a better career, a better partner, or whatever it is. We're always on the way. We're always on the way. And this is an obstacle to realizing that you exist now, or you exist in this now. Because in fact, this view seems very metaphysical. It seems like a metaphysical question, what is now, or what is it to be now? But in fact, the time being now seems to me, in a way, the most empirical of claims, or an extremely empirical claim. For example, nobody has experienced the past. Right, well, maybe there are time machines or something like that, but normally, in common sense, if you like, we do not experience the past, and we do not experience the future.
We experience
now. And we're always, if I can use always in this meta way to talk about time, we could, maybe not. I think you can. It's never. If you say it's never not now, people know what you mean if they're interested in this sort of thing. Now. And then there's a third large question, which is about being. What is it to be? And you probably know that since Kant, since the critique of pure reason, there's been a lot of debate about whether exists is a property. If I say that something exists, am I saying it's got a characteristic or a property? Whether exists is a predicate, a word that's used to ascribe properties or used adjectively. I quite like Kant. He's a very interesting thinker, but it seems to me that the idea of being rather than not being does not have to be tied to the existence of particular things. In particular, it doesn't have to be tied to the notion of a plurality. It's not necessary that there should be a plurality in order for there to be being rather than not being. It seems to me that there can be being full stop. Or there would still be being even if there were no beings, even if it's the case that there couldn't be beings without being, right? I mean, clearly beings couldn't be without being, but the reverse entailment doesn't really work. There could be being without beings, right? Now, if all that's right, that gives you the possibility of pure being, maybe in the sense of Hegel, possibly in the sense of Heidegger, but definitely in the sense of Parmenides, because Parmenides thinks there is only being and he thinks there's no nothingness. Now, I think Parmenides is right about that. Parmenides is right when he says there's no such thing as nothing, or no such thing as nothingness. Not particularly because there's being, but because the idea there is nothing is incoherent, because there is nothing means there exists nothing, okay, or nothing has some sort of existence. I think Heidegger sees this as well when in Sein und Zeit he says das nichts nichtet, the nothing noths, as my former colleague, my late colleague Michael Inwood translated it, the nothing noths, or he asked the question, does the nothing noth? And Heidegger writes in this way because he doesn't want to say that nothing exists or that nothingness has a kind of existence. He wants to say something else. It annihilates or it noths. Now, if nothing necessarily doesn't exist, it follows that being necessarily does exist. In other words, being is necessary. Now, something that interests me about all this is that these properties of the now and pure being, the more you inspect them phenomenologically, or the more you analyze the concepts and the more you think about it, the more they seem to have some essential properties of God. God is, construed in the Judeo-Christian tradition. For example, God necessarily exists according to Christianity.
Exactly,
and being necessarily exists or cannot not exist. And the now, not in the changing sense, but in the always present sense, this is necessary for the changes in the present. It seems unbounded and infinite. It's the ground of what happens. So the unchanging now, or the changeless now, looks more and more like the presence of God, or has something in common with the presence of God. Now that has interested me increasingly over the last 10 or 15 years, the idea that these really profound or difficult questions in philosophy can be answered theologically, that philosophical questions have theological answers. Now I think that's right. And I don't have any previous axe to grind. I don't really mind, you know. I mean, I was brought up an atheist. My dad was a communist trade union organizer in the 30s and 40s. You know, I was baptized technically into the Church of England when I was a baby, but I never followed it. But it so happens that the resources for answering metaphysical questions are very considerable in Christianity. And
definitely
lacking in agnosticism and atheism.
Well, for many, for a very long time, even when we study the history of philosophy, it is inevitably connected to theology.
Yeah.
But those questions, they don't stop being important.
That's right.
And
That's right.
even when we try to get rid of in philosophy of metaphysics, which is a way, at least for some intellectuals, just
I know.
but it comes back.
It does come back. Yeah.
After all, because as you mentioned, all of those three things, they happen to be all the time. We ask ourselves the question, what makes me me, and when it's going to stop?
Yes, very good.
Because it's going to stop at some end.
I
and we know that. So the time.
Well, it might carry on. We don't really know. I mean, I think when you die, it's still now. There's still being, and I think there's still the unus of you. I think that the human being gets pretty ropey. You know, I mean, it's even worse than now. You know. Okay.
But we have this, of course, this intuition that the core of ours is immortal.
Yes.
And it's part of the universe. And it's part of the bigger element.
Yes.
But those are theological assumptions already.
Well, I think they're theological assumptions, but I think you can argue for those conclusions quite rigorously. And if you do some kind of meditation, I think you can observe this, you can see this, or this can be disclosed depending on the meditation you do. You use the word intuition. I mean, I think that there is intuition, but not just in the sense of you know something and you don't know how you know it. You know, you guess that something's happened in India or something. But in a different sense, I think there's a kind of consciousness that is exercised in thinking and in perceiving, and can be exercised without thinking or perceiving in certain kinds of meditation, like in Descartes at the beginning of the Meditations. An interesting question is, did Descartes meditate? I think the answer is yes. He's saying, you know, now I'll turn my mind away from the objects of the senses, this sort of thing. So there's a kind of stillness or inner stillness or glow of pure consciousness that is disclosed once thinking stops and once sensory input stops. Now I would call that intuition, and I'd say by intuition you are disclosing something that does not admit of change, of beginning to be, ceasing to be, being destroyed, being created, this sort of thing. It's something timeless.
I agree. I agree. Even when I said this word, is because something which I think I tend to know a priori, which I don't have a moment when I learned about it. But it's very often hard to express how I know it. But this is what I would say a part of God in us, which talks to us. But it is also a moment when philosophy makes a bridge which you mentioned, Buddhism, but it makes the same bridge to Christianity.
I think Buddhism gives you the experience of what we're talking about, but it doesn't provide an explanation. So you need Christianity to do that. Well, I think Hinduism, you need a very sophisticated and complicated religion to make sense of what we're talking about, a metaphysically sophisticated religion, and I think Hinduism and Christianity are metaphysically sophisticated. But Buddhism only gives you the experience, and I think it's because it's a very practical religion. You don't really have to believe things in Buddhism, not really. Or someone might be a Buddhist to a greater or lesser degree, irrespective of what they believe.
I fully agree. It's more practical, more on a day and on suffering. On
practicing compassion.
Exactly. Which, of course, can have a bigger path to bigger metaphysics.
I think so.
If it takes, if we take it seriously.
I think so.
But in everyday usage, it can be just practical.
Yeah.
But all of this is philosophy.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Even if we are just changing and talking about
I agree with that. Yeah.
aspects.
Yeah.
And it's even it doesn't seem, as we start with the beginning, to so practical or so important.
Yeah.
It's somehow immortal.
Yeah.
And we still ask those questions.
Yeah.
And I'm absolutely certain this, as long as human beings are here on Earth, they're going to ask those questions.
Yeah.
And to some extent, it is scary.
Yeah. I think there is a fear of metaphysics, a fear of the metaphysical questions, and as you suggested, there's been a reaction against metaphysics over the last 200 or 300 years. I mean, I think that since Kant wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, Western philosophy has been more or less included within Kant's thought. I think Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is more or less a prison or a cage, which includes the subsequent movements in philosophy. And if you look at analytical philosophy, structuralism, post-structuralism, phenomenology, dialectic, you can find them in the chapters of the Critique of Pure Reason. You know, if you like, the difference between the transcendental aesthetic and the analytic is like or logically similar to Husserl's Epoche in the 1913 book Ideen, in the Ideas. Or if you look at the chapter on the categories and the forms of judgment in Kant, it's a kind of structuralism, the fundamental concepts and categories that we use to structure what appears to be real. And then, of course, Kant is critical of dialectic, even though he uses the term in the Antinomies chapter and in the whole section called the Transcendental Dialectic. In the third antinomy, he anticipates synthesis, because of course he thinks that we have both free will and the Newtonian world is causally determined, and this anticipates synthesis in Hegel. And so far as he engages in Marx, it's as though Hegel's Geist or self-consciousness is the transcendental unity of apperception written all over the universe. You know, it's as though Kant explodes in Hegel and becomes everything. Or suddenly metaphysical, even though Hegel...
Definitely, all of those philosophers which you mentioned are somehow, let's say, progeny of Kant and what he discovered.
Yeah.
And I say the break is with Wittgenstein, the young Wittgenstein.
I think Wittgenstein's a completely Kantian thinking. Yeah, I think it's 100% Kantian. Yeah, the early and the late. Is 100%. I think the breaks with Kant are in Frege, because he thinks arithmetic is analytic, and Kant insists that the sentences of arithmetic are synthetic a priori. I mean, Frege agrees they're a priori. Okay, so that's a big break. Although even Frege thinks that Kant is right, that the sentences of geometry are synthetic a priori. Another big break is utilitarianism, with John Stuart Mill and before him James Mill, because obviously Kant's moral philosophy is very utilitarian. He's got this deontological, duty-centered, rule-following view of everything. And then I think people who think that you can prove the existence of God are anti-Kantian or broken with Kant. Say, my colleague Richard Swinburne, somebody like that, is not a Kantian thing. It's as though Kant never wrote, okay? And there's somebody there. Heidegger, I think, tries to break out of the Kantian prison in the 1927 book, in Sein und Zeit. But Sein und Zeit is not finished, it's not complete, because Heidegger says he doesn't want to do metaphysics. He doesn't want to do metaphysics. But to answer the Seinsfrage, you do have to do metaphysics. You have to at least be like Parmenides, and maybe you have to be like Saint Augustine, right? You've got to do, Thomas is not enough. It would have to be Saint Augustine. It would need some sort of Neoplatonism, something like that, to answer the Seinsfrage, to realize really that pure being has all and only the essential properties of God. But after he failed to finish Sein und Zeit, Heidegger brought out the Kant book. It came out, pretty much afterwards. And so you can see Heidegger turning his attention directly to Kant, because Kant is in the way of the Sein und Zeit project.
I fully agree. Kant's create the cage for a lot of minds.
Yeah.
But this is all extremely interesting.
Good.
And Professor, just to wrap up this episode, for anyone who is approaching philosophy, what would you say?
Well, I think you have to start with the questions, and I think one wonderful thing about philosophy is whether you are Plato and Simone de Beauvoir, or somebody who knows nothing about philosophy, these questions are here. These questions are here. So you don't have to go and do a PhD in it, although that's a very worthy enterprise. You don't have to go and do a PhD in it to confront the philosophical questions directly or head on. So, I mean, for reading, I would read something like Bertrand Russell, The Problems in Philosophy, or Tom Nagel, What Does It All Mean? One of these slim introductory books. I'd say that for the movements, for structuralism, post-structuralism, phenomenology, and so on, the major practitioner has the best introduction. Husserl's Paris Lectures, or Deleuze's What Do We Recognize by Structuralism, or Derrida, The Positions Interviews, or Sartre, L'existentialisme et le humanisme, the talk he gave after the war. The main people themselves, their slim volumes, are the best introductions, I think.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Professor Stephen Priest from Oxford University was the guest of Common Sense Generation, showing you how complicated but also how simple philosophy is. And I also thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible.
This is Common Sense Generation.